Well, good afternoon, everyone. Pleasure to have you joining us for this session on drawing a picture of the Canadian Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Community through self-identification data. My name is Karine Morin. I'm a Director of Policy and Interagency Affairs at NSERC, and also the lead of a tri-agency EDI action plan. And a pillar of that plan is actually to have collected self-identification questions and to have collected this data to analyze it. And it is Dr. Mary Rose Bradley Gale who will present the work that she has done during the past year. She was then a MITAX Science Policy Fellow at NSERC. And also with us is our Vice President of Research Grants and Scholarship, Dr. Danica Guzny. So you are in great company here. In the discussion forum, you see that we've posted a link and you can follow directly from the screen, or you can, for future reference, go back to that link. So without much more of an introduction, I will be turning it over to Mary Rose.
Hello, thank you, Kevin, for that. And thank you all for being here today. So I will just quickly go through the, and like Kevin mentioned, the presentation in the discussion forum. And we also invite you to comments you have or discussions like directly in the discussion forum. And with that, I will start. If I can change. Okay. So as Kevin mentioned, the agencies have been collecting self-identification questionnaire from applications since 2018, and NSERC has committed to reporting on. And there's been some reporting on it, like through every grants competition, but this was one of the first analysis of this data. And I won't go into the exact details of the questionnaire, but the questionnaire asked for applicants to self-identify their gender, their visible minority identity, Indigenous identity as abilities, and their age. So there is now an updated question. You can follow the link to see that. And we are using data in a few different ways, and this is what I'll be focusing on today. So looking at whether our award is representative of the application population, like are those who are applying to the award as represented in the awarded population. 2, is the application population representative of the Canadian population? And lastly, I'll show what are similarities and differences across our different kinds of programs, across different disciplines and groups, and can these provide opportunities for targeting specific populations? And I'll also be highlighting the importance of disaggregating the data and intersectional analyses. And we want to spend the bulk of our time showing you some of the data. And so, as I mentioned, one of the analyses is looking at the awarded population versus the population. And this would be a lot of data. So right now I'm just showing you a summary table, which describes whether there was a significant difference between the award and application populations for these different groups from the questionnaire across 4 different programs: the PhD programs, postdoctoral fellowships, discovery grants, and Alliance, which is our partnership grants. And tested using chi-squared test. As we observed, there was very few large differences in representation, so we wanted to use a statistical tool to help us identify any significant differences, which could then be an area to investigate further. And also just to note, even where a significant difference is not observed, we will still be watching for trends over time and keeping in mind that the self-ID data is only one aspect of EDI. And so I hope you can see from this table, there are a lot of no's, meaning there's not a significant difference of the representations of the patient population and the awarded population. And this is a good sign, meaning the grant review process is not leading to a difference in representation across these groups in these programs. However, what I've outlined in red are 2 exceptions when you disaggregate the data by year for 2021. we did observe in the PDF 2021 competition a higher representation of women who were awarded compared to their representation in the applicant pool, and a lower representation of visible minorities in the awarded pool compared to the applicant pool. And on this next slide, I'll go into that a little further, disaggregating the data by both visible minority identity and whether they identified as a woman or man in the application. And when you look at the data here, well, I just told you that women were more represented in the awarded. This was only seen for the women who did not identify as a visible minority. And just to take a step back to say that in red on the left side of the cluster is the application representation, and in blue on the right side of the cluster is the representation in the awards offered for the PDF 2021 competition. And also what I just told you was that visible minorities were less represented in the awarded pool compared to the application pool. But you can see that it is more the visible minority men, but not the women. So I just wanted to highlight this as for the importance of disaggregating the data and looking at the intersectional analyses. And just wanted to pass the mic over to Karine for our discussion question on curious out there, like, to talk about the importance of disaggregating the data and whether other organizations are looking at this kind of data. So we'd be happy to hear your thoughts in the discussion forum, or you could raise your hand and come on screen and chat with us.
I was worried we'd have a shy group, but hopefully someone would have experience in looking at their community, whether it's at an institutional level, perhaps, or if we have colleagues from other departments.
Or if you just have any reactions to this data or looking at intersectional data. Well, and if not, I can keep going and we can come back to it.
Yeah, maybe people will have more thoughts by the time you can go through more of this analysis. Thanks, Rose.
Now I've lost my mouse. There we go. Okay. Okay. Oh, I also do see someone. Maybe. All right, where was I? So the second type of analysis was comparing what our applicant population looks like compared to Canadian population. So shown here is another summary table indicating whether the representation in the NSERC applicant pool is higher or lower than the Canadian population. And on the next slide, I'll show you the percentages so you can have a better idea of the lower or higher. But just to show here that unfortunately we do observe that many of these groups are lower than the Canadian population, including women, Indigenous peoples, and persons with disabilities. For groups like what the questionnaire identified as gender fluid, non-binary, and or two-spirit, we do not have good comparator data, so I wasn't able to show that. But on the other side, the representation of visible minorities is actually higher across NSERC programs. But again, I just want to highlight the importance of disaggregating this. So we have applicants are asked to further identify if they identify as a specific group. And so not all visible minority groups are more highly represented. For example, applicants who identified as Black also have lower Canadian population. So if we want to stop here, and if anyone wants to react to this data, and also just the thought about should we be comparing ourselves to the Canadian population? We did this partly because we don't have good data on the eligible population. So the Canadian population is one of the things we can compare to, and thinking about what level of representation should we be aiming for and why. I don't know if Kathleen wants to elaborate on that question. Before I go on.
Well, one thing to note is the comment that was made earlier, I think still applies to what you've just spoken of, that the data on offered rates is disappointingly low, but perhaps not overly surprising. So what we are demonstrating here is what has long been known about underrepresentation of women in STEM. I think when we look around, we also recognize that there aren't many Indigenous peoples in these fields of research. Always a little bit more difficult to ascertain population that would be people that identify with having a disability. But then when we sort of look around and see the makeup of the STEM community, there is, as we were just explaining, some diversity there, but not all proportionally representative of Canadian population. So I'd welcome those thoughts. What is not drawing a whole lot of Canadian talent into STEM? We know what the literature sort of says, but I wonder if others want to speak to their experience or what they have really personally observed in terms of what draws people away. We see increasing number on the undergraduate makeup of the student population across higher education, but then it just seems like it drops off. Anyone would like to comment on what they've observed, what they've experienced? And Rose, I think we're just going to try and build up some momentum here, and maybe towards the end we can have people willing to comment a little bit more.
Yeah, we'll keep going.
Send it back to you.
Maybe we're not looking at the right thing. Oh, and I see a raised hand, maybe?
So I did not see anything in the Q&A. I now see something coming up into the discussion, and then I'll turn to the hand perhaps. So in the discussion, have there been studies about why students are leaving STEM culture within engineering faculties? Many of us can speak a little bit to what the literature is pointing to is some of the barriers, and we would say systemic barriers, very much built into the system of expectations, et cetera, et cetera. So maybe I turn it to Danica. Do you want to be put on the spot and speak to what we know of barriers and how we're trying to address them at NSERC?
Sure. So yeah, there are many studies that speak to culture inclusion in particular as being the key barriers for people remaining within STEM, and it changes from discipline to discipline and from institution to institution and community to community. So there's no, I guess the consistent theme would really be that one of inclusion specifically, and how to form a culture where people feel that they are part of that. And STEM, as you know, well, academia more broadly, it's been built around a culture built on hundreds and hundreds of years of really a very narrow, narrowly defined metric of who's in and who it's built for and how it works. And so trying to adopt a broader definition of excellence overall. And so this is something that we've been trying to move towards, not just NSERC, but all of the granting councils and the universities. And there's efforts underway like the San Francisco Declaration on Research Assessment, which really is trying to emphasize that it's the culture and how we measure success in academia and in research specifically goes beyond these very traditional narrow metrics of success in various publications and high productivity in measured very quantifiably. So being able to broaden that inclusive definition of research excellence, I think, is a big part of keeping people in STEM, but there's much more. So that's my offhand remarks to start the day, but opening it up to others if they have other thoughts.
Thanks, Danica. And I now have seen the Q&A appear in front of me, so I can go back to those questions that were asked. How do we consider persons with disabilities? Person here, I've not heard a person who is blind or hearing impaired to be part of a faculty team at the university or a research institute. So I'm not sure I read that quite clearly. How do we consider persons with disabilities? Maros, do you want to just speak briefly, or perhaps I will?
I think it's outlined in the
20.
Sorry, I think there's a lag. You can go ahead, but I think the question in the questionnaire defines what they mean. And I know in the new questionnaire, there's going to be, or there are different you can further identify which disabilities. Was that what you were going to add, Karen?
Indeed. And what I think we will add here is that in regards to people who self-identify as having a disability, and yes, in 2020, the revised questionnaire gives a very broad definition of disability, so as much as of a physical impairment as a intellectual, cognitive, and otherwise. We do suspect that there is a lower rate of self-identifying as or choosing to answer that question. And so the numbers are very low, but perhaps the representation as reported just really is at the lowest it can possibly be. But there's no question that that is an area across the different research communities that seems to be well below what the 2016 Canadian census had indicated at population level, where there's 17% of the population identified as having disabilities. And in a more targeted survey, that number even went up to about 22% of individuals who identified as having a disability. So that the numbers are so low in the STEM and other fields is certainly of concern to us. Going back to from our Q&A, will you be looking at why there is a difference between men and women and visible minority success rates?
Perhaps Danica, do you want to comment on that?
I was going to say.
Okay, sure. Yes. So the data that is presented is part of an overall ongoing study that we're doing, and she's taken a very good and thorough first pass. So as we highlight these, see that those data, and I can't see them very clearly on my screen, so I'm going by memory here, that it was kind of a one year competition, and that previous years we hadn't seen that. So first thing, obviously, we maintain the data analysis, we keep the monitoring and the tracking, and we make sure that if there's a continued trend, this is obviously a problem and we need to act on it. And in these cases, digging down into why there would be a difference, the numbers are quite small in a single competition year in a particular program. So the difference of having one or two more awarded may actually flip the numbers a different way, and so that's something that we need to dig into as well. So there's digging into it from a culturally, why would this be happening, and then a data specific, why is this happening from a numbers perspective, if it's just a matter of statistical significance, and then also getting a sense of the longer term trend of it as well, but not letting it go on, I would say, too long. We need to really get a good sense of it and get some actions in hand if there's bigger issues at play here.
I'll read another question, perhaps. Given that a major challenge for Canada is a lack of skilled workers, perhaps we need to consider that many of the visible minority applicants, higher representations, are immigrants. We need them, of course. This doesn't eliminate the problem of lower representation of other applicants. Perhaps a comment more than a question there, but Mary Rose, do you want, or perhaps Danica, speak to that perhaps bump? I think mostly notice from doctoral to postdoctoral a higher representation of visible minorities, and that might be sort of drawn from an immigrant population that is here for those higher studies. Don't know if we can say that with any confidence.
I'm happy to jump in, Mary Rose, and you can correct me if I go rogue on you there. But so this is something that I had also inquired about in terms of the status of permanent resident or Canadian citizen, or who's applying to these programs. So we get a better sense of who the applicant population is. I don't have those data in front of me, but it is something that we are committed to looking at and getting a better sense of. And then if there are issues, for instance, a lot of our applications are written in, and maybe that's not the first language spoken by a very, very qualified candidate. And so how do we try to remove those barriers so that we can support the best scientists and researchers coming into the country?
And that just partly covered a question we had on whether we consider that there may be a link between mother tongue and success rates. So definitely language is something that we've also been paying closer attention to. And the 2020 version of the questionnaire does ask more on language. Let me see if I can.
There's one raised hand. I don't know if we have...
Oh, someone has been indeed very patient. So if we can have the person with the raised hand turn on the microphone and ask their question or make their comment. Just not quite brave enough.
Would we want me
Maris,
to? I could.
Do you want to just continue on and please? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, sure. I'll just go through the last two slides, and then we can come back to the questions as well. Okay, so the last question was looking across programs, and I think there was a question in Q&A there that I tried to answer that would be shown on the slide here. So this is looking at the proportion of applicants across programs. In the order that they are, it's the PhD, PDF, Discovery Grants, and Alliance. And then I also added the Canadian census population in gray. And so what we wanted to show is across the different groups, they have different representations in these different groups. But applicants who identified as gender fluid, non-binary, and/or two-spirit, if they identified as Indigenous or as persons with disabilities, have low representation across all programs. If you look at women, they follow a trend that is probably not surprising, where we see higher representation in PhD, a little lower in PDF, and lower Discovery Grants and Alliance. And Visible has a different pattern where we see lower PhD, higher in PDF, lower in Discovery Grants, and higher in Alliance. And so just one thing to mention, one interesting observation is that Discovery Grants and Alliance have different representation of groups, and these are both faculty level grants, but different in their intent and the kind of projects they fund. For example, applications from engineering disciplines compared to Discovery Grants. And it's a field that's known to have low representation of women. Perhaps this could explain that discrepancy. But I did disaggregate the data at a higher level of discipline. So the bar on the left is Discovery Grants, the bar on the right is Alliance. And there are 4 disciplines that I grouped the applications into based on their research subject codes. Except for computer science, mathematics, and physics, we did still see less women applying to engineering and life science, physical sciences in the Alliance program, Discovery Grants. So that also brings up the question why there might be different why might different programs have different representation, and could there be an opportunity to address this? Piece of data I was going to show, and just to say there are more ongoing analyses. These are pretty preliminary, so the data will be starting to be reported on in the Discovery Grants dashboard. So I think you'll be hearing more from NSERC on this data. But yeah, we can go back to the questions now.
So quite closely linked to that last slide you presented, someone at Women in Gender Equality Wage says we're super interested into intersectional data. One thing we are interested in is digging down into STEM. So for instance, we have gender parity in the S of STEM in science, but not in the TEM, technology, engineering, and maths. But within science, who are the women represented? So we don't quite get at who in the slides presented, but we certainly see variations across the different disciplines. So indeed, that is of interest to us to disaggregate that way into the disciplines. And the follow-up, I think, on this, on the TEM, what are the barriers within those aspects, the TEM of STEM, that we don't find in the S? I suspect it is a sense of purpose, how we communicate the TEM of STEM. Danica, back to you. Do you want to interpret a little bit what we are perhaps sort of our hypotheses as to what are the differences, cultural differences across sciences, and what we see in terms of representation in discovery grants, and how this doesn't all translate into our research partnerships, and all other variations across disciplines. Some of our hypotheses there, perhaps?
Yeah, I mean, it's a tough hypothesis, but it's certainly something that we are looking more into. And I welcome anyone who's listening in on this, any thoughts that they may have if they're within the engineering and math particular disciplines. We do know that women are underrepresented in those particular disciplines. There have been different hypotheses. I'm not sure that I buy into any of them. And again, willing to have that debate. But, the discussion around that math and engineering is largely based on math, that there are some women who are told early on that this is sort of a gendered, you're being told from an early stage that this is more for men than for women, which we know is not right at all. We know that women excel at math and do so from an early age. So I don't necessarily subscribe to that hypothesis that it's just that. I think that there are other things, again, more on the inclusion side. Once you get into more of the research and academic space, that I'm not in the mathematics, I'm on the biological sciences side, where there are a lot of women represented there. So I don't know what it would be in those particular spaces that would not be inclusive, but I'm happy to hear discussions on that. I don't know if others have any thoughts here, Mary Rose or Kevin, on it, but it is something that we are certainly trying to get a better understanding of.
Well, we could speculate some more, but I'm also very conscious that this clock is ticking, and I'm going to maybe read one more question here. Within NSERC, to what level does reinforcing or enhancing the pipeline factor into the development of funding initiatives relative to the focus on research outputs, whether that is traditional scientific outputs or knowledge translation capacity development, perhaps focusing on components that create resilient sourcing of diversity at multiple levels would better serve the goal of creating equitable science funding or applicants. What level does reinforcing or enhancing the pipeline factor into the development of funding initiatives relative to the focus on research outputs?
If I were to interpret that, and I apologize, Kyle, that I'm probably not interpreting that properly, but that, how much does building capacity in certain underrepresented groups, now that we're seeing the data in particular, factor into how we're setting up our program design and doing our peer review and passing out the money. relative to what we were doing before, which was, really focused on research outputs, as you say. So this is something that, as you know, NSERC is undergoing a strategic planning session, and we are looking to see what new things we can do to try to build better diversity and inclusion within the ecosystem. So this is something we're taking on right now as we speak. And I'm cognizant of the time, so I'll pass it back to Karine.
Yes, well, thank you. And I'm apologizing for the difficulty I had in reading those questions, just a narrow little cap. But thank you all for joining us. Appreciate that there were lots of you here.